Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to guest Dr. Alex Meierhoefer.
Hi,
Hello.
Melissa. Hey.
So glad to have you here. I'm Melissa Minnich, founder of the Sacred Soul Alchemy Mystery School and live event host for Humanities Team, a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is to make conscious living pervasive worldwide by 2040. I'm coming to you live from Austin, Texas. We are excited to have Dr. Axel Meierhoefer, retired Air Force officer, an executive, and a multi-entrepreneur, joining us today. Where are you coming from today, Dr. Alex?
Yeah, I'm in Spain right now at the Costa Blanca.
Oh, I love it. That's so wonderful. I want to welcome Dr. Alex's audience, the Scene Network, those streaming live through the Humanities Team Facebook page, the Humanities Team YouTube channel, and Stream Plus members that are here in the green room with us. Thanks for being members. And some of you that are on our camera, welcome everyone. Because it is a live program, we will have time for comments and questions. So try to get your questions in within the first 30 to 40 minutes of the program. Post it in the chat and you may get your questions answered by Dr. Alex. Dr. Alex Meierhoefer is a retired Air Force officer, an executive and multi-entrepreneur that helps people to invest in well-performing residential properties to generate passive income and financial independence. He is the author of The Ideal Wealth Grower, available on Amazon, and the creator of the Humanity Stream Plus Masterclass titled Protecting Your Family and Your Legacy. He believes that real estate is more than just numbers and properties. It's about creating a life of abundance, providing for your loved ones, and leaving behind something meaningful. However, he also knows that with every investment comes responsibility and the need to protect what you've worked so hard to achieve. So today we're going to be diving into these important topics like your will, legal protection in business, insurance as part of your empire, estate planning, so that you can really protect your family and your legacy and learn how to build abundance and keep it for future generations. So Alex, your business is the Ideal Wealth Grower, and its aim is to reach economic independence and ultimately financial success through investments in real estate. But can you tell us a little bit more about how did you get into this? What got you into this idea of the Ideal Wealth Grower? What brought you down this path?
Well, it started out basically, and you mentioned it, Melissa, that I retired from the Air Force and was initially recruited by a software company in Southern California and did that for not quite 5 years and then decided to start my own business. And shortly after, I kind of realized, I mean, I should have probably known before, but I kind of realized, okay, all these kind of protections that existed aren't there anymore. And how would I potentially get any kind of additional retirement income? And I looked into like 401ks or maybe have a stock plan or anything like that. But you have to keep in mind that was around 2005. So we just went through the dot-com bust and stocks were really not very much the thing that you wanted to do. So I thought, okay, what could be an alternative? And started researching, what do successful people do? And that might be a little funny to the audience, but one of the very successful people at the time was the Terminator, who also had somewhat of a little bit of a connection, not in a real way, but he is Austrian, I'm German, we're both in the United States. And I found out that he was, unbeknownst to a lot of people, one of the largest residential real estate investors in California at the time. So he took his money from the movies and put it into real estate, and that triggered me to research it. And then I found out, okay, well, it's a little tricky because, as I said, Southern California, you mentioned that you've been there as well. It's a pretty expensive place. So investing for performance where you want to get something out of your money is really hard to do. So for me, that triggered to say, okay, how can I do this just for myself, for my family, somewhere where the properties are actually performing? And that's how it all started. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. And so what is the Ideal Wealth Grower? What is that all about?
Well, the middle part is the easiest. We want to obviously accomplish wealth. That's what triggered me originally. And I'm a little bit of a blabbermouth. So when I started talking to my friends about it, sooner or later, they said, hey, can I do this too? And that's how Ideal Wealth Grower came about. But ultimately, the other two words, ideal and grower, are actually not just words that are there, but they're also abbreviations. So ideal stands for, the I is for income, the D is for depreciation, E for equity, D for IDEA for appreciation, and L for leverage, basically to get your assets financed. And those 5 things are the things that are pretty unique in that combination to real estate. And then when I basically started to accept people into the mentoring program, I looked at how do we actually go through the process. And there's a pretty famous book by a guy named John Whitmore. It's called Performance Coaching. That he wrote originally for people in sports, and then it was adopted very much into the business community. And I looked at that, and to be a little cheeky, I studied the process, the so-called GROW process. And to me, it occurred to me, at least I felt, that really only covers the first session. What do you do? No mentoring ends after the first session. So I expanded it to grower. So just to real quick for the audience to know what that means. So the G starts out as what is your goal? And it's can be a big goal, the so-called big, hairy, audacious goal. And then what are the sub goals? Then the R stands for what is your current reality? Then we look at what are the obstacles and opportunities that you're currently facing. Then what actions will you take to overcome those obstacles and take advantage of those opportunities? And that is typically the end when you read the book. Now, what I added was the E, which is now we meet again, let's say 2 weeks later, and I would say, hey, Melissa, what was your experience when you took these actions? And you would tell me a little bit of what happened. And then the next question after discussing and describing that would be, okay, so you took the action, you had these experiences, what were the results, which is the second R in grower? And you tell me what the results were. And then my last question typically would be, okay, now in light of these results, does that impact in any way any of your goals? And it may or it may not. But if you think about it, now it becomes a cycle. Right now we can go through it every other week or however often we meet to see, okay, where are we? What have we changed? What have we done? What obstacles have we faced? What were the experiences? And sometimes, I give a little, if you allow me, a little quick story. One of my very early clients wanted to find properties that are really high performance in cash flow. And so we went through and we found out that was one of her goals. She wanted to get to something like a $3,000-4,000 a month income by buying properties over time. And ultimately, it was pretty obvious that we needed to look at what's available. So I sent her a bunch of properties that the providers we work with had offered to me. And 2 weeks later, we meet and I said, okay, so did you check them out? Did you look? Did you run the criteria that we discussed? She said, yes. And I said, so what were the results? And her answer was, they're all ugly. And I'm like, okay, they're all ugly. How do you mean? And she said, well, I would never want to live in any one of those. Have you looked at how they look like? I'm like, okay, you live in a pretty affluent area in the Los Angeles Hills. Nobody says you're supposed to move to Ohio and move into any of those properties, right? But it told me then ultimately, okay, yes, the goal was there to get cash flow in properties, but there was one little hidden thing that we needed to add, that they needed to at least appeal, like curb appeal or something like that. For some people that listen to us might say, really, you buy that? Well, no, we do this because if you are the investor and you want to be proud of your investment, that's a part of it for some people. Other people say, I don't really care how they look like. If the one that doesn't look so nice makes me $400 a month and the other one makes me $300, I always go for the one that makes me more money. Right. So, but grower is basically the cyclical mentoring process, and the ideal is kind of the items, the benefits that we get from investing in real estate.
I really love how you created a whole system that then backs onto itself and comes back up and starts over again, because that, I think a lot of times when people are working in situations or trying to learn something new, they get to the end, the stop, and then they're like, now what do I do? And you've shown a very clear path to, like, here's the process. And then you now come to result number 1, and then you go back, and then it's the reevaluation. And now we get to go through that process again. And so it's almost infinite, right? Like you can always come back and do this process again and again. And I think that's a really simple format for a lot of people that can get overwhelmed and confused, especially when it comes to things like money, finances, investments.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for describing it so nicely, Melissa. The other part is it is a little bit built-in accountability, if you think about it,
Mhm.
right? My mentoring clients typically after, having gone through 3, 4 of those sessions and experiencing the process, I can detect that they basically start asking themselves, where am I in the cycle, right? Like I know in a week we have another session. Have I basically quote unquote done my homework? Do I have answers to those questions that we're going to address? And that gives a little bit of a discipline as well, to stick with the program, because ultimately when we first start, when this initial goal is being mentioned, my goal for people on, as a reciprocal goal is always to at least get the first property done during this first year of mentoring.
Mm.
And to be able to do this, we need to set up the business. We set up the LLC, the bank account, the identification number, all the things that are necessary, in my opinion, before we actually go and look at the properties themselves. And so all that to be done, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about it as we move along, but those things belong together. And it might sound like a lot to work together for a year, but when you think about becoming a businesswoman or businessman and having your first investment properties, if you're not already experienced, it's a pretty good task list to go through.
Mm. Oh yeah, I started my business in 2010 and got my first mentor slash coach in 2013, and I haven't ever gone back, right? Like I believe once you are at that level where you're doing investments, you're running a business, you're doing those types of things, that you always want to have somebody on your team, right? Like somebody on my team that's there that knows more or can support me. And they say the 5 people that you hang around are the people that are going to determine your life. And so you might as well have them be your coaches and mentors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I can say with a lot of pride that people who have joined our program, I don't know of anybody who has really left. Yes, obviously the intensity that is pretty strong in the beginning, in the first like 6 months, we really stick to meeting every 2 weeks and we have emails and all that stuff. But and I can say this from my own portfolio, there's always something quirky happening. And even if it's not real estate stuff, kind of unusual happens. And so people, that have been in the 12 months program, 18 months in, come up and say, hey, I'm in the process of trying to do this and it's kind of weird. Can we have another session? And obviously we do. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so before we move on into the protection, I want to break down ideal. So can you just break down the IDEAL a little bit more? I know you were explaining what each of them meant, but like for some people that may be brand new to finances, or watching this and being like, I want to get into this more. I'd love to give them just a little bit more explanation of some of those words that you said before we move on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the I mentioned stands for income, and the income is first and foremost. Let's just take an example and say you bought a house 123 Main Street in Columbus, Ohio, and paid $180,000, and you get $1,700 a month in rent. Those $1,700 are basically your income, right? Now, because you have that $180,000 house, by the rules that the government gives us through the IRS, you have the right to write off, depreciate the value of that house. So I always use the analogy to say, okay, imagine that house were like a how would you say, like a machine, that if you had a business that needs a machine to produce a product, you bought that machine and that machine is running, and everybody would say, yeah, but that machine is not running forever. It has a certain lifetime and then I need to replace it. While the government has determined that the lifetime officially for residents is 27 and a half years. So if you take your $180,000 divided by 27 and a half, you get a number that is, in this case, in my math, probably 8,000 or something like that per year that you can write off or depreciate on your taxes, which if you were to do this like a balance sheet, if you do this for 27 and a half years, the value on the books of that house is zero because you depreciated, basically wrote it off. even though it's not really a machine, but I also like the analogy because you could say it's a little money engine, right? A little money machine that, you get rent in, you pay off the mortgage, you pay off property taxes, you pay off your management, and the rest is your money. So that machine house makes you a little bit of money every month. So that's basically the depreciation part. And how does that work? That those 8,000, or depending on how much you paid for, goes directly into your tax return, right? So if you use a CPA or you do your own taxes, there's a place for investment properties. How much can you depreciate? 1/27th and a half of the value of the house per year. Right, so that's the D. Then we have equity. That is basically two things. Number one, when you buy an investment property, same like when you buy your own house, you typically have to make a down payment, right? Like, so investment properties start down payment about 20%. So if you look at a $180,000 house, you had paid $36,000 down payment. So that's part of the equity. And then the other part of the equity is when your tenants pay the rent and you take that rent money and pay the mortgage, there's always a piece that is interest, and the other one is principal. So every month a tiny little bit is paid off on the balance. So that becomes equity. About in the first years, it's about $1,000 a year. And those two things together is basically your equity that's in the house. There is a little bit of a confusion. I'm going to mention that in a moment. Okay, so we have the IDE, then the A is the appreciation. And that is the difference between the price that you paid when you bought the house and the value of the house as you have it. So let's say in that particular area that the house is, it appreciates 4%, or let's say 5% per year, 4 to 5% per year. So you bought it for 180. So that's $9,000 would be 5%, right? So after the first year, it would be worth 189. And then after the second year, let's say it's the same 5%, it would be 199 or something like that. So those 9,000 and then 99,090 and so forth, that's the appreciation of the house. Now, some people say, how much equity do you actually have if you talk about your own residence? And they add that increase in value also to the equity. But in reality, in our perspective, we want to look at equity on your down payment and how much you pay down your financing. And then the appreciation is how much did it increase in value. And then the final thing, the leverage is, I mentioned 20% down payment on a single family home. So the leverage is the other 80% of those 180,000 that comes from the bank. Right? Because if you think about it, I like to use this example. We mentioned this house costs $180,000 and you put $36,000 in. Just imagine for a second that you had $180,000 and you could buy it outright for cash. Right? So the one scenario, you get the financing, you get your $1,700 rent. The other scenario is you finance it. So 36,000 are gone. Now you are still at 144,000. You buy another one for another 180,000 and another one and another one. So your 180,000 will get you almost 5 houses. Right? That's the leverage. So instead of buying one house outright and get $1,700 a month for that one house, you can basically get like 4.5 houses for your 180,000.
Wow.
And that's the leverage if you think about it, right?
Yeah. Beautiful. All right. Thank you so much for sharing. The breakdown of that is very valuable to see all the different pieces, and especially in this aspect of real estate. And that's really where you're talking about, like, if I'm going to build a legacy or if I'm going to protect my family, one of the ways is through the investment of real estate. And so you have a course here on Humanity's streaming platform called Protecting Your Family and Your Legacy, How to Build Abundance and Keep It for Future Generations. So can you tell us a little bit about why do you feel it is, why is protection of the family and legacy so important? And what do you mean by it exactly? And then we're going to watch a clip from the first clip from this introduction to your course?
Yeah, so in a big picture view, it is partially because of the society that we're living in. Even though I know that Humanities Team is a very empathetic and nice and warm organization, we still have to face reality. And one of the things of reality, at least in my opinion, is that as soon as you get successful, people get envious. If you get extremely successful, everybody gets supposedly envious, even politicians and stuff. But for like you and me and people like us, when we start getting successful and something goes wrong, there's a tendency to say, let's see if Axel has any assets that it's worth going after with a lawyer or with the court or with a lawsuit, right? And I believe it is important that we protect ourselves against that. The other aspect is, and this is, again, a philosophical perspective, is to say, who are you actually building this empire that starts with your LLC for? And some people say, well, I'm just doing this for myself, for my current family, for me, my wife, and my kids. And as long as we are around, that's what we're doing and why we're doing it. But if you think a little bit longer term, if your kids, for example, are relatively little when you start, well, by the time they go to college, there might be a property that you have that pays for their tuition, right? By just having the rental income. Or if you think a little longer term, those kids will potentially have kids too, right? They might not ever have to be worried, because if you think in those categories, and we take your example and say, okay, well, we use leverage for our investments, and in a 10-year period, we build a portfolio of, let's say, 12 to 15 houses. And then we have them in belonging to our family. And as we go, the value of money goes down. Everybody has experienced that. Prices go up, value of money goes down. That means sometime in 20 to 25 years, all these houses that we have initially accumulated will be paid off. So now think at that. If you had 10 houses, just to make an easy calculation, they were all cookie cutter, exactly the same. We never increased the rent. From day one, they paid us $1,700, our little example, and they still do this 25 years later. That's really the most conservative way to think about it. That's $17,000 a month. That's what your grandkids would have as income if you organize it properly, versus having potentially very little to nothing.
Awesome. That's really a powerful way to think about it. And I got lots of questions around, like, oh my gosh, how do you get 10 houses or even one for certain people? But let's watch the clip first, the introduction to your course on Humanities streaming platform.
Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to start a new series, and I want to get you first an introduction on what is going to be covered in this series. And the title, the overall theme that we are actually getting at, is how do you protect your assets and yourself in an environment where people are very, very easy and quick to sue you, to be angry with you, to take you to court, to those kind of things. But also, how do you include in that to make sure that your legacy, the things that you are creating, are protected long term, even if something happens to you or to your spouse. So what we are going to cover in this series is, on the one hand, insurance for your life. And I'm going to explain what is term life insurance and what is whole life insurance and how does that work. Then the importance of a will that describes what are your intentions if something were to happen to you and you get run over by a bus or something like that.
Well, let's start with the first piece of that. You say insurance. Why is insurance important for people?
Well, the one aspect is obviously a little bit of responsibility. I take my own example. Let's say I'm the only one who gets run over by a bus or falls out of the sky or whatever happens. I don't want to have my wife to have a lot of burden or a lot of struggle to make sure that what we have started to put together and that we have applied leverage against, like we mentioned earlier with the financing, that still has to wait 15 years, 18 years, 20 years. So if I were the one who would just, for some reason, no longer be around, the the life insurance policy would pay enough money to pay the majority of those mortgages off. So that's just a little bit of taking care of the survivor. The same thing would, by the way, happen if we were sitting on a bench and a bus would run both of us over. Then it's still the thing that I wouldn't want my daughter to have to deal with all of that stuff. That's one aspect. Now, the other aspect, and I mentioned that briefly in the little clip, is the difference between term life insurance and whole life insurance. Term is basically what I just explained. You say Melissa is worth $5 million. We get her a term life insurance policy. You pay, I don't know, $80 a month. And should you be run over by a bus, it's the money comes to your survivors. The whole life insurance company is a cool little additional thing. Same thing, it has the term, the however many millions you say that you want to cover, but it has basically a savings account built in. So your payment every month is a combination of what it costs to have this life insurance term plus money that you basically save. Now you might say, okay, is a life insurance policy really a good saving? Well, think about it. Remember that house that we said that is $180,000 and you need $36,000 down payment? Let's just say over the first year of that insurance policy, you put in $40,000 into that savings account of that policy. Now you can go to the company, then New York Life or Mutual, Omaha, whatever, any of those, and say, okay, guys, I have that $40,000 in my policy. I need that money. And without doing anything, they will give you a loan, interest only, for the balance in that account. You take that and buy the house. So now you have your down payment comes from your life insurance thing. Now, but what happens? Ultimately, what we always want to accomplish, if you look big picture, is we want to create little engines, right? That's why I mentioned we want money engines, just like somebody buys a machine to produce something for their factory. So the one money engine that we get is our $180,000 house. But guess what? That 40,000 that sits in that life insurance policy, even though you borrowed it and used it as a down payment, is still there. And it's still going to be used every year by the life insurance company. So over time, you get to a point where the tenant pays off the whole house. If you really take a long-term view, let's say 30 years, the tenant pays it off. The house is free and clear, and that 40,000 or 36,000 that you took out has been sitting there and accumulating benefits from the life insurance company, and they make about 8% per year on average. Imagine if you do any kind of compounded interest calculator, you put 40,000 for 80 years, and that wouldn't be, you put next 40,000 or 12, whatever your policy is every year, but even if you just look at that one time, so for 30 years, the money is sitting there and is basically growing, while it's also sitting in another engine being the house and being used to own the house without you making a down payment. So you have the insurance part and the house together, two engines instead of one. And should something happen that we all want to not have happen, then your family is protected.
And 8% is pretty good. It's better than what we do with the stock market.
That's true, but life insurance companies basically very often are policy owner owned.
Yeah.
So they're not for-profit organizations. And so really almost all the money, except for what is going for the term life part, goes into investments.
Beautiful. So do you believe that getting insurance is like step number one before I go to look to buy property, before I go to do anything else, that I should first get insurance?
Well, it depends a little bit. One of the first things that we do when we come together and somebody says, I'm interested in your mentoring program and investing in real estate and so forth, is to say, okay, what is your current financial situation? Some people may already have some form of insurance. So if that's the case, and we look at, okay, let's just stick with this example. If we wanted to get those $40,000 into the life insurance policy, is it better to change an existing or get a new policy and do that first? Or is it better to say, if I have a total of $50,000, just as an example, we would probably be better off to first buy the house, put the remaining money after the purchase of the house in the policy, and then see if we over time get to those 40,000. See, the big picture would be to say, okay, Melissa wants to get, just for the sake of argument, to a number per month of these financed houses of, let's say, $6,000. And just to make it easy, these $180,000 houses all pay us $500 a month in free cash flow after everything else is paid, right? So you know you need 12. That makes you $6,000. So instead of necessarily, and that would be the answer to your question, saying, okay, do I do this insurance thing first so that I can then borrow the money to put the money into my first house? You could also say, big picture, that will work when I'm getting ready to buy house number 5 or house number 6 a little bit down the road, because I'm not putting 40,000 in a policy. I put maybe 12,000 a year or 10,000 a year or something like that. Right. So it's not a cookie cutter every time. It's exactly the same. It depends very much on what your situation is and what you can always do just in general terms. And, that's a little modification to the answer is you want to have the term part, that how much should I be insured for covered. But the savings part, that is a component that is depending on where you are, what you can put in, where you're starting and so forth.
Okay, so let's talk about the average American, because the average American, they do studies that say somewhere between 50 to 75% of average Americans don't have a savings, right? They're like living in this space, they're spending their money, they're doing stuff like that. What is someone like that wants to start to build wealth and maybe doesn't have money to put a down payment on a house or, to do these types of things? Like, where does that average American start in protecting the family and their legacy?
Yeah. Can we constitute that this average American has a job?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
But I'm kind of cheekily saying that because there is a little bit of a point to say, okay, a lot of people are not very good on their own to save.
Right.
You said they don't have a lot of savings, but because of that, the government in the 80s decided, okay, how about if we help you saving by basically doing it without you even realizing it? And that's called retirement savings account. Now, there are a bunch of different ones, and I don't really think we want to dive too deep, but what most people know is either is a 401k or an IRA savings account. And to answer your question, so this is basically money that is taken out of your salary before you ever even get it. It goes into a 401k or IRA account, and your employer typically matches to a certain extent how much you put in, they put in for you as well. So you could say this is automated savings, probably partially because people are not that good putting the money aside for themselves. Now, most cases for these retirement accounts are structured that the company signs a contract with an organization like Vanguard or Fidelity or so forth, and they just take the money, they do a little interview with you, and they say, hey, Melissa, are you a low, medium, or high risk kind of lady? And what would you say?
Oh, I'm a high.
You're a high risk person. Okay, so we're gonna tell the manager of our fund at Fidelity that your money should go in high risk investments. And then unless you really kind of track it or so forth, they do that for you and they charge you fees. That's what's most common. But you also have, in the vast majority of cases, and I'm not claiming to be like a investment advisor or IRA expert or anything like that, but in most cases, you have the right to have a self-directed account. And in a self-directed account, basically you're saying, no, I don't want somebody else to handle my money. I want to handle my money myself. And you can do this at any time in most cases, right? Even if you've already been working for 5 or 8 or 10 years and money has accumulated there because this person at Fidelity has always done these high risk investments for you, you can say, okay, I want to switch to self-directed. And now, because it's self-directed, you can take money from that and make it a down payment in real estate.
Okay, fascinating, beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. So number 2 on that list was a will. So we have a short clip that we're going to show you from the program that is all about the importance of having a will. And then we'll come back and ask Dr. Alex some more questions about it.
In a nutshell, for one, you want to not just assume it's only you who is affected. You want to look at what happens if I'm affected, scenario one, and you describe in your will what happens then. Oftentimes people say, give it all to my spouse. Scenario two, what happens if my spouse and I are both affected pretty much at the same time? Where are my belongings going then? Most people would say to my kids. And then scenario three, what happens if for some crazy reason, both you, your spouse, and your kids are affected at the same time? Then what happens? And then you might say, well, you want to have it either to, if your kids have kids, or you want to give it to a particular charity, or you want everything, which is the next thing that we will address at some point, in your estate planning and in your trust, have somebody take over on behalf of your family members who are no longer there to do certain things with the belongings. If you have real estate, if you have a business, if you have an art collection, car collection, anything like that. The important thing is, though, as much as this is not really a topic that most people like to address, I hope you can understand, as we're building a growing and growing passive income portfolio made out of residential real estate, just think about it. If you say, I want $4,000 or $5,000 a month as my passive income when I reach my time freedom point, in almost all cases, that means you have at least 10 or more properties in real estate. And in nowadays numbers, 2022, that means you have anywhere between $1.5 and $3 million in assets. And that is very substantial. And I think if you address it that way, even if it's just for the real estate alone, then you can say it's definitely worth leaving something for people to understand what you wanted to happen, rather than courts and unrelated people who don't know you and don't know your family deciding what happens to the houses, what happens to any other things, any art, any collections, anything that you own. So that's why having a will is so important, and it protects basically your family and your heirs from some kind of arbitrary distribution of what you accumulated.
So should everyone have a will, or is there a certain time in the lineage of when I have a certain amount of investments or things like that, that I should go ahead and do that will?
I would say you should have it. Anybody who doesn't have one should get one. And it's not hard. You can basically get a general form downloaded from Google and use that. You can even just write it in your own handwriting. I mean, like I said in the video, it's not a topic that people like to talk much about, but just think about that situation with the helicopter in New York the other day, right? So that was one of those crazy cases where probably the whole family was wiped out. Does anybody know if they thought about a case like that ever happening? Right? I'm sure they didn't think that their children would ever be affected, at least not at that age, right? So yes, it's a little bit of a morbid topic, but you're doing the other people in your family and in your bigger community a huge favor by telling them, what do you want? And by the way, it's important to realize, I didn't say this in the video, but it's important to realize you can change it anytime, right? So the only other thing, and this is probably important to mention, I also mentioned it in the course, is having it is one thing, but you should have somebody you trust who is not directly related, a core part of your family, to know where you have it. Right?
Yeah,
because otherwise, you don't want to necessarily, I mean, obviously when the whole family is gone, then somebody will have to go and check through all your stuff. But if there's a lawyer, or if there's somebody, like your accountant or your CPA or somebody in that kind of capacity, where you say, okay, just so you know, there is a safe, or there's a place in the house or wherever you put it, so that people can find it.
Yeah, I went through an experience in 2022 where my father tragically, unexpectedly passed away, and we didn't know anything. Did he have a will? Did he have this? We're digging through drawers, looking through things, like trying to figure it out. And it was, for me and my sister, as it turned out, he didn't have one. It was quite a challenge. And it was like one of those things. He was young, so we didn't expect, we didn't expect that. So I've been through personal experience of like, oh my gosh. And it was literally right after that. And I'm in my 40s and I never thought to ever have a will, but it was after that happened that I went immediately and was like, not going to do that to anyone, and went on and was like, okay, gotta have this done, because I didn't realize until it impacts you. I think sometimes you don't even realize, if you think nobody's going to die in their 40s or their 60s or whatever, and it can just happen. And it's such a challenge for those that are left behind to try to figure things out if you don't have some sort of guidance in some sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's one aspect to also consider is when you are building, when you are growing your portfolio of assets, getting a will, like you just described, Melissa, is basically the step where you are pretty much dependent on yourself. As the asset portfolio is growing, ultimately, you want to consider something called estate planning, which goes a little bit further than that. You might want to consider if you want to have a family trust or something like that. And in this context, what's kind of like a nice benefit is that when you do this, you basically go similar to the mentoring into a relationship who helps you on a regular basis as your trust, as your assets grow. And so a good estate planner would remind you at least once a year to say, did you accumulate anything meaningful that should be added to your will?
Mm-hmm.
While you were doing this by yourself, as I'm assuming you did it for yourself, it's not assured automatically that you go in yourself once a year and say, okay, what else did I get that I didn't even consider when I wrote this first time that should go in there?
No,
Right.
and actually, now that you mentioned it, it's not even in my correct name anymore. So fascinating, great things I'm thinking about sitting here right now. So let's dive into this. People that may not understand what exactly estate planning is, what is a trust, like why do I need a corporate structure because I'm just a person, that kind of thing. So let's like dive into these things for the person that's like maybe hearing this stuff for the first time.
Right. So basically, your estate is all the things that you own, right? And own in the context of investment, especially real estate, is basically the things that you have the deed or the title for, even if 80% of it belongs to the bank. On paper, legally, you own it. So all the things you own, your jewelry and if you have art or furniture or whatever you have, all of that is part of your estate. So now not everything is necessarily things that anybody is interested in, but when it comes to houses, real estate, jewelry, gold, silver, you name it, anything that has value and keeps increasing in value, it is definitely advisable to say what should happen to it. Now, the estate in the context of trust and corporate structure, I like to give you an example because we mentioned when we first started that we want to set up as the first thing an LLC to put everything in a professional environment. That would also be the place where, for example, your property management company sent the rent, from which then to the bank account of the company. That bank account will be used to pay the mortgages, to pay insurance policies. Maybe if you get big enough, you might want to have a car or an office and a computer, all that kind of stuff, right? So I call that the operations company. But as you now, let's say you buy one or two of these $180,000 houses that we mentioned a few times. At the second one, now you have two houses. Let's just for easy calculation say they are $360,000 together. At that point, if you were in my program, I would say, okay, let's create the next LLC. And the idea behind it is what's called a series. That's something that has been defined by the IRS. The easier way, the way I describe it is your first LLC, the operations thing, I call that the mother. All the operation, everything goes through the mother. But the mother can have children. So that's just a simple LLC. The only thing it does, it owns the title, or in this case, two titles of those two houses. Some people even do a title for each house. Then you buy the third one and the fourth one and the fifth one and so forth. And each one gets a little LLC just to hold the title. Now, you might on first glance, anybody listening to us say, well, that's a little bit complicated. Why are we doing this? Well, think about it. Let's say somebody comes to visit one of your tenants in one of your houses, has an accident, breaks a leg, and claims that the reason he or she broke their leg was because something was wrong with your house. So what will happen? They go to a lawyer, and the lawyer will say, okay, let me look if Melissa has anything that's worth going after. Now, let's say there's Melissa. She followed Axel's advice. She has her mother LLC. She has 3 or 4 children. Everything is beautiful. And her name never shows up anywhere. Because obviously we don't call these things Melissa 1, 2, 3. We call them something like Green Tree 1 and Green Tree 2 and so forth. All right. So first, they get annoyed because they have to dig around, find out who owns this thing. Then they find out it's owned by an LLC, and there's nothing else. This LLC has no operations, no tax returns, nothing. The only asset, the only value that we can go after is that house at its current value. So when the lawyer looks at it, he or she will say, okay, I thought I had $1 million lawsuit about your broken foot, but the maximum we can get is the current value minus the mortgage. Don't forget, the mortgage needs to be deducted if the court says, okay, Melissa, that was your fault. That little step was not quite well enough marked. We award $1 million to the people that sued you. When you say, wonderful, I have a $120,000 mortgage and $50,000 value. It kind of sucks that I'm losing $50,000, but that's all I'm losing. Frankie, on the other hand, who has the same number of houses, same value, never did an LLC, owns them all in his name. Not only is Frankie going to lose all his houses, he's also going to lose his residency, his car, his jewelry, his everything else that he owns. That's the point, right? So series, and ultimately, when you get to a point, I'm always kind of starting to suggest to people, when you get your 5th house, that asset value nowadays gets you to about $1 million just in those houses, oftentimes also closer to even $2 million in asset value. And you probably have some other stuff as well. That's when it kind of starts making sense to look at your overall estate and think if you should start setting up a trust. And the trust is ultimately to say, okay, if this situation, scenario 3 from the video, were really to happen, you can say, I want the trust to continue to operate because I don't want anybody to sell all these houses and get that all these little engines to die. I want the money to go to, I don't know, the dog sanctuary, but not by selling this stuff, but just by giving them the cash flow that comes out of it. Mm-hmm. And so then the dog sanctuary can get money forever, as long as these houses exist and this overall trust is generating a couple $1,000s a month. You do something wonderful to a worthy cause, rather than the courts kind of breaking it up and selling it, and some greedy people want to kind of get a few dollars.
That's really beautiful. So since we've been talking about legal protection, the last clip that we're going to watch today is about that. It's about the importance of the legal protection.
In a nutshell, for one, you want to not just assume it's only you who is affected. You want to look at what happens if I'm affected, scenario 1, and you describe in your will what happens then. Oftentimes people say, give it all to my spouse. Scenario 2, what happens if my spouse and I are both affected pretty much at the same time? Where are my belongings going then? Most people would say to my kids. And then scenario 3, what happens if Here we are with another video in our series, The Ideal Investor Journey. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about legal protection. Now, what do we mean by that? I'm not talking about the corporate structure. I'm talking about how can you protect yourself in the sense of a business owner who will receive contracts, will buy properties that have a lot of documents associated with the closing documents, with insurance documents, with mortgage documents, and so forth and so forth. And as you grow your portfolio as an ideal investor, there's an increasing likelihood that somebody is unhappy with you and doesn't agree with what you decide, whether that's a tenant or property management or a service provider, a turnkey provider. It could be pretty much anybody. Now, why is it important to have protection? Understandably, we live in a very litigious environment. And in the United States, if somebody doesn't like what is happening to them, they have a high tendency to just say, okay, well, then I'm just going to sue you. Anytime, and I encourage you to try to figure this out, if you go and just try to find a lawyer in your local area and ask them for something trivial. Somebody is trying to sue me because I paid them late. Somebody is trying to sue me because I supposedly damaged their car or damaged something, or something in one of my investment properties went wrong and they want to sue me. And just ask, how much does it actually cost to get some sort of legal advice? And you will find out most lawyers have hundreds of dollars an hour fee, and if they carry you all the way through a lawsuit, it can add up to large amounts. This has actually caused a disparity between large organizations or very wealthy individuals who can afford to have a lawyer, and it oftentimes feels, if you follow the media, that if you have a lot of money, your likelihood of being held accountable, or basically the laws being applied to you just like with other people, is more or less dependent on how much you can spend on lawyers. And the best lawyers get the best outcomes for their clients, which is understandable, but it shouldn't really be that just because we either don't have a lot of money or don't want to spend a lot of money, we cannot get the same legal protection. And that's why I'm always saying, when we start the ideal investor journey, either during the accumulation phase or when you enter one of the 4 main roads that we discussed in another video, you should also start setting the mindset of a business owner. You want to be eye to eye with other businesses, and typical businesses, especially more established businesses, have a legal department. Now, I'm not saying you need to have a legal department, but what I recommend is that instead of waiting for the day when somebody is suing you and then reach out and try to find a good lawyer, I recommend get a membership in an organization that provides legal services. Now, the one.
Mhm. Okay, so I love that, because I think about lawyer fees, and I know I have several friends that are lawyers. They can be it can be really expensive, but you talk about the fact that there's a simple way for your average American who's just getting started building their assets to be able to have the protection of this without, the hundreds of dollars of fees that can go with it. So what do you suggest for, you said, there's a membership that you can get. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Right. Yeah. So the idea of a membership is a little bit like an insurance policy, just to explain why does this even work. So you pay membership fees, let's say all year long. In my case, I can say my membership fee is about $80 a month, and it is half is for my personal protection legally, and the other half is for my LLC, my business protection legally. But this year, nothing happened. Right. So that means basically I made 12 payments. What is that? $960, nothing happened. Maybe next year, nothing happens either, but then something comes along. So now I'm $1,800 in, and the first thing that this membership would do if something comes along is to say, let's look at it, let's analyze it, let's react to it. In the form of a letter, or writing to the court, or doing a document analysis, and so forth and so forth. So I'm just saying this is how it works. And if you now think about, there's millions of people each paying $80 a month, that's how they are able to basically provide these services in a membership setup. What we recommend when we set up the LLC is also to set up the membership, because most of these organizations, the one that we use and recommend, obviously anybody can go out and find their own, but we work with an organization called Legal Shield, and their memberships are quite affordable. They offer this combination for your private side and for your business side. And they basically grandfather you in. The year you start, whatever your fee is, that's your fee forever. Right. And so the sooner you start, in a way, the better it is. The other thing is, on the business side, at least for Legal Shield, I cannot talk to about anybody else, and I'm not saying you should do Legal Shield. I'm just telling the experience that we have with our clients and myself, is that the business side allows for document reviews. And one of the things I can clearly say, when you get a little bit more actively involved in anything that has to do with investing. And when we talked about IDEA, we have all these benefits, but obviously they come with a lot of documentation and paperwork. Anybody who ever bought an apartment or a house or anything like that, you know the pile of paperwork that is associated with that. And to be able to say, I'm a member at Legal Shield or a similar organization, I can send them the paperwork to say, hey, can you look at this and tell me if I'm getting myself into something that I should potentially stay out of, or is all of this sound, right? Because in the beginning, even though I provide the mentorship and so forth, it's almost like drinking from a fire hose. So the more support you can have, the better. And I'm also not a lawyer. I'm just a very experienced investor who's mentored a lot of people. Still, even when I get something that looks a little unusual, I always send it in and say, hey, can you take a look and tell me if this is okay or what should be changed? Right? So this is just, and this in the video I mentioned, like if you have a business that grows a little bigger, you will find that every business has either a counsel on call, so to speak, or even a legal department. Well, we're never going to get that big, but Legal Shield or something similar is kind of like our legal department where we can make sure that we're not signing something that gets us in trouble. Right. And so this is how this all fits together. And this goes for all the documents, whether you have a will, they can help you with that in their package. When you join them as a member, they immediately send you kind of like the template on how to properly fill out the template for a will. And all these other things that happen over time, they are basically there. And what I also like in all of the ones that I know are very similar, they have a huge library of stuff to download because sometimes you want to be the one initiates a contract. Well, instead of just downloading it from Google, if you go into your membership area and you download one that is already legally reviewed, it's much more likely that it's not going to cause trouble for you or the other side, whoever you're doing a contract with. So that's that part that goes together. See, what we talked about, Melissa, I think is important is kind of the emotional part. Then why a business and how do we actually structure the business with the mother and the children and the will and the stuff. And then how do we protect one more layer around it by not making mistakes because we are not lawyers. So we get ourselves affordable lawyers.
Dr. Alex, I think it's absolutely wonderful that you're helping the average person really understand how to build wealth. What I know to be true, reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and all these different books and over investments over the years is that we are not taught how to build wealth or how to leave a legacy or how to, protect our families. The financial literacy in the United States, especially, I don't know about the rest of the world, but especially in the United States, is very low. And I just want to say thank you for how passionate you are about this and, sharing this message with everyone, because we've given such incredible tips today that I think anyone can understand on really how to start to build a legacy for themselves. Is there anything, any final words or word of wisdom or anything that you want to share with the community today?
Well, one thing, if you take all the things, Melissa, that we have talked about together, one of my goals, besides building this portfolio of assets, mainly real estate, is that you also adopt a mindset of the queen or king of your empire. Right? Like a little, maybe 1 minute on that is, if you really think about a successful business starts out with a founder. When it gets a little bit bigger, it starts having departments. And when it gets a little bit bigger, it has divisions and multiple locations and all that. But ultimately, all the people that come into the business are in some employed role. That's pretty standard. We all understand that. What I'm trying to get across when we say Melissa is the queen of her empire, she hires a bank to give a loan. She hires property management to manage her property that she just bought. She hires an insurance agency to provide the necessary either life insurance or homeowners insurance or stuff like that, and so forth. You go and take all these different departments. And with that, when you are really fully living into being the queen or the king of your empire, that also means if any one of those doesn't perform because they work for you, then you got to find somebody else. Any other business owner, everybody listening to us who is an employee knows if I don't do the job that's asked for me and that I'm getting paid for, I'm not going to be there very much longer. And that's your role as the queen or king of your empire, to make sure that everybody that you have hired is performing properly and according to what they promised you. And every so often you have to make the hard decision to let them go to get what you deserve.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Alex, for all your wisdom today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for our course in Protecting Your Family and Your Legacy with Dr. Alex Meierhoefer. It is now available on the Stream Plus platform. Join Stream Plus now and gain immediate access to this incredible program. You'll get access to Dr. Alex's course and our incredible spiritual teachers and programs. We're proud to say that Humanity Stream Plus is the largest global streaming platform for consciousness raising masterclasses and transformational education. We are a nonprofit and also give back with our 1-for-1 program, sharing our content with those who cannot afford the membership. I want to thank Steve Farrell, Dee Meyer, and the production team, Jim Gray, Garth Catterall, Nanette Kennedy, Marthaler, I'm doing them good today. Sorry, guys. And Karen Weissert and the rest of the humanities team. Thank you all so much for joining us. Bye. Thank you, Dr. Alex.
Bye.